The door of the car closed with a soft, final click. Outside, the city lights blurred into long streaks of gold and white, but inside the cabin there was only silence, thick, heavy, and alive. In the back seat sat Michael Jackson, motionless behind dark glasses, while the man in the front seat tightened his grip on the steering wheel, unaware that this quiet drive would one day become a story the world would ache to hear. For years, this was how the nights went. No cameras. No screaming fans. Just the hum of the engine and the unspoken weight of history moving through the darkness. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. The chauffeur was not a bodyguard, not a confidant, not a friend, at least not in the way the world defines those roles. He was hired to drive, to protect the bubble of silence Michael Jackson needed when the world became too loud. He learned quickly that silence was not emptiness. It was a language. When Michael Jackson stepped into the car after rehearsals, after court appearances, after endless meetings with lawyers and executives, he carried more than exhaustion. He carried decades of expectation, judgment, and loneliness. And the driver learned to read it all without a single word spoken. Michael Jackson rarely spoke during those rides. He would sit upright, hands folded, eyes hidden behind sunglasses even at night. Sometimes his reflection appeared in the window, ghost-like, merging with the city outside. The chauffeur later said it felt like driving a man who was both present and impossibly far away. The silence wasn't awkward. It was intentional, protective, almost sacred. Michael Jackson had spent his life being heard by millions. In that car, he chose not to be as the years passed, the chauffeur became a witness to moments no camera ever captured. He saw Michael Jackson remove his sunglasses only when the streetlights were dim, revealing eyes heavy with thought. He saw him hum quietly, unfinished melodies that floated for a second and vanished. He noticed how Michael Jackson would sometimes stare at children playing on sidewalks, his expression softening, as if he were watching a life that could have been his. Still, there were no questions asked, no conversations forced. The silence remained unbroken. Then came the nights that changed everything. The accusations had exploded across the media like wildfire. Headlines screamed. Television panels argued. Michael Jackson's name was no longer spoken with wonder, but with suspicion. Each night, the chauffeur drove slower, more carefully, aware that any wrong turn could mean flashing lights and cameras. Inside the car, Michael Jackson grew even quieter. The silence deepened, not empty now, but heavy with something close to grief. One night, rain fell hard against the windshield, each drop sounding louder than it should have. The city felt smaller, darker. As the car stopped at a red light, the chauffeur glanced briefly in the rearview mirror. Michael Jackson was looking straight ahead, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. For the first time in years, he spoke that it was not a confession. It was not a complaint. It was a sentence so simple, so devastatingly human, that it stunned the man in the front seat into stillness. I just wanted to be quiet again. That was all. No elaboration. No explanation. Just the ache of a man who had lost the one thing he valued more than applause, peace. The chauffeur didn't respond. He knew better. Some sentences are not meant to be answered. They are meant to be carried. From that night on, the silence changed. It was no longer just protection. It became resistance. Every quiet drive was an act of defiance against a world that refused to let Michael Jackson rest. The chauffeur noticed subtle differences. Michael Jackson sat closer to the window now, sometimes resting his forehead against the glass. His humming stopped. The city lights reflected off his face like distant stars, unreachable. Despite everything, Michael Jackson remained unfailingly polite. He always thanked the driver at the end of the night. Always the same soft voice, always the same words. It was a reminder that behind the myth, behind the controversy, there was still a man choosing kindness in the smallest ways. The most surprising moment came much later, after the trials, after the headlines had burned themselves out and left scars behind. It was a late drive, the kind where the streets feel abandoned and time slows down. The chauffeur was taking a familiar route when Michael Jackson suddenly leaned forward. "Can you take the long way?" he asked. It was such a small request, but it carried weight. The long way meant more time in silence. More distance from everything waiting at the destination. The chauffeur nodded and turned the wheel without a word. As the car merged onto a quieter road, Michael Jackson let out a breath that sounded like relief. Minutes passed. Then, unexpectedly, Michael Jackson spoke again. "They think they know me," he said softly. "But they don't know this part." The chauffeur felt the sentence land like a confession, not of guilt, but of invisibility. This car, this silence, this anonymous stretch of road, this was the part of Michael Jackson the world would never see. Not the king of pop. Not the headline. Just a man passing through the night, hoping not to be recognized by his own reflection. When Michael Jackson died, the chauffeur watched the news like everyone else. The images were loud, chaotic, filled with crowds and commentary. But his memories were quiet. A closed car door. Rain on glass. A single sentence spoken into the dark. While the world debated legacies and controversies, the chauffeur mourned something simpler: the end of those silent drives, the end of being trusted with someone's unspoken truth. Years later, when asked what Michael Jackson was really like, the chauffeur paused for a long time. Then he said, "He was tired. And he was gentle. And he was very alone." That sentence, like Michael's, needed no explanation, because sometimes the most powerful stories about Michael Jackson are not found on stages or in studios, but in the quiet space between destinations. In the silence where a man could finally stop performing. In a car moving through the night, carrying a voice that only spoke when it truly had to. The silence did not end with Michael Jackson's passing. In many ways, it became louder, after the funeral, after the white gloves and black umbrellas, after the crowd slowly dissolved and the news cycle moved on. The chauffeur found himself replaying those nights alone. He would sit in his own car, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, suddenly aware of how much space one presence had once occupied. Driving had become automatic for him over the years, but now every quiet road felt unfinished, like a sentence cut short. What the world never understood was that Michael Jackson's silence was never weakness. It was survival. In public, Michael Jackson had learned to smile on command, to speak in careful phrases polished by decades of scrutiny. But in that car, there was no script. No need to explain himself. The chauffeur realized, too late, that he had been entrusted with something rare, the version of Michael Jackson that existed only when no one was watching. There was one memory the chauffeur had never shared publicly. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was fragile. It happened months before everything collapsed. The night was unusually calm, the kind where the city seems to hold its breath. Michael Jackson entered the car without his sunglasses. His eyes looked clearer that night, almost lighter. As they drove, he tapped his fingers softly against his knee, keeping time with a rhythm only he could hear. Without looking up, he said, "Do you know what scares me the most?" The chauffeur hesitated. He wasn't sure if the question was rhetorical. Years of silence had trained him to listen more than respond. Still, he answered carefully. "No, sir." Michael Jackson nodded, as if confirming his own thought. "That one day, I'll stop being real to people," he said. "That they'll only remember the noise." Then he smiled, a small, tired smile. Not the quiet. The chauffeur didn't know it then, but that was the night Michael Jackson unknowingly summarized his entire life. A life louder than any generation had ever witnessed, yet defined by moments no one bothered to record. After Michael Jackson was gone, offers came. Journalists wanted interviews. Producers wanted dramatizations. Everyone wanted a piece of the silence. The chauffeur refused most of them. How do you explain something that was never meant to be spoken? How do you monetize trust? But time has a way of softening fear. And eventually, the chauffeur understood that staying silent forever might be another kind of injustice. Not to the headlines, but to the human being behind them. He began to speak, carefully, selectively. Not about scandals or theories, but about stillness. About the way Michael Jackson would thank him every single night. About how he never slammed the door. About how he always waited for the car to fully stop before opening it, as if refusing to rush even the smallest moments of peace. These details didn't trend. They didn't go viral. But for those who listened, they changed something. They reminded people that Michael Jackson was not a myth carved in marble. He was a man who sought quiet corners in a world that refused to give them. A man who understood that silence could be the last place where truth survived. Today, when the chauffeur drives at night, he still takes the long way sometimes. Old habits don't disappear. Streetlights pass in familiar rhythms. And every now and then, when the road is empty and the city feels distant, he swears he can almost hear a soft hum from the back seat, unfinished, unrecorded, but real. That is the legacy the cameras never caught, not the records sold. Not the awards won. But the courage to sit in silence and remain gentle when the world demanded noise. That is the Michael Jackson who lived between destinations. The Michael Jackson who spoke only one sentence when words truly mattered, and perhaps that is the most honest way to remember him. The chauffeur never changed cars after that. Years passed, yet he kept the same model, the same dark interior, the same faint scent of leather and night air. Friends told him it was impractical, outdated, unnecessary. He never argued. Some spaces are not meant to be replaced. They are meant to be remembered. Every so often, he would park somewhere quiet and sit with the engine running, just listening. In those moments, he realized something that had taken him a lifetime to understand. Michael Jackson had not been silent because he had nothing to say. He had been silent because he had said everything already, to the world, to history, to millions who listened but rarely heard. The sentence Michael Jackson spoke that night, "I just wanted to be quiet again," was not a wish for escape. It was a wish for balance. A plea to exist without being consumed. And the tragedy was not that the world misunderstood him. The tragedy was that the world never stopped to ask what that sentence truly meant. As years went on, documentaries were released, books were written, debates continued. Michael Jackson remained frozen in time for most people, trapped between extremes of worship and judgment. But the chauffeur carried a different image. He remembered Michael Jackson adjusting his seatbelt carefully. Remembered the way he would nod politely to security guards. Remembered the softness in his voice when he said thank you, as if gratitude were the last thing he still controlled. One night, long after everything, the chauffeur picked up a passenger who didn't recognize him. The man in the back seat talked non-stop, complaining about work, about fame, about being misunderstood. At a red light, the chauffeur caught his own reflection in the mirror and almost smiled. He realized how rare it had been to sit with someone who chose silence not out of emptiness, but out of dignity. When the passenger finally left, the chauffeur turned off the engine and sat there longer than usual. He thought about how history remembers people. Loudly. Selectively. Often unfairly. And he wondered how different the story of Michael Jackson might be if the world had known him the way the silence knew him, not as an icon. Not as a headline. But as a man protecting the last quiet pieces of himself. The truth is, Michael Jackson trusted very few people with that version of his life. The chauffeur never asked for that trust, never demanded it. He earned it by doing the hardest thing in a world obsessed with attention, by listening without speaking. That is why the sentence still echoes, not because it was dramatic. Not because it was profound. But because it was honest, and honesty, when spoken softly, often lasts longer than noise shouted to the crowd. And yet, even now, the story refuses to end, because silence has a way of teaching those who stay with it long enough. The chauffeur eventually understood that his role in Michael Jackson's life was never about driving from one place to another. It was about holding space. About becoming invisible so someone else could finally feel real. In a world that demanded Michael Jackson explain himself endlessly, the car became the only place where no explanation was required. There was one final detail the chauffeur carried with him, something he had never spoken aloud until much later. On certain nights, just before arriving at their destination, Michael Jackson would straighten his jacket, adjust his posture, and place his sunglasses back on, even if it was midnight. It was a ritual. A quiet transformation. The man in the back seat preparing to become the symbol again. the chauffeur realized then that fame was not something Michael Jackson wore all the time. It was something he put on, and silence was where he took it off. After Michael Jackson's death, fans continued to argue about who he truly was. Genius or victim? Innocent or flawed? The debates never stopped. But the chauffeur learned that truth does not always live where the arguments are loudest. Sometimes, it lives in the pauses between words. In what someone chooses not to say. Michael Jackson had spoken to the world through music, through movement, through spectacle so powerful it reshaped culture itself. But when the music stopped, when the lights went dark, all he wanted was to exist without being consumed by his own echo. That single sentence, "I just wanted to be quiet again," was never meant for history. It was never meant for documentaries or headlines. It was meant for the dark interior of a moving car, for a man who understood that listening could be an act of mercy, and perhaps that is why it still matters, because in an age where everyone is shouting to be seen, Michael Jackson's quiet longing feels almost revolutionary. He reminded us, without trying, that being heard is not the same as being understood. That fame can amplify loneliness. That even the most celebrated voice on earth can crave silence more than applause. The chauffeur still drives at night sometimes. Not for work. Just for memory. The city has changed. New buildings. New lights. New noise. But the roads remain, and so does the habit of taking the long way home. When asked if he misses Michael Jackson, the chauffeur doesn't answer immediately. He looks ahead, just as he always did. And then he says, "I miss who he was when no one needed anything from him." That is the version of Michael Jackson this story belongs to, not the legend frozen in time. Not the controversy endlessly replayed. But the man in the back seat, watching the city pass by, choosing silence as his last refuge, and maybe, if we listen closely enough, we can finally hear what that silence was trying to tell us all along. What most people never realize is that silence leaves traces. Long after Michael Jackson was gone, the chauffeur began noticing them in unexpected places. In the way he slowed down near empty intersections. In how he lowered the radio without thinking. In how uncomfortable noise had become. Silence, once shared, reshapes the person who holds it. There were nights when the chauffeur remembered small, almost invisible gestures. Michael Jackson tapping twice on the glass when he wanted the window cracked open. Michael Jackson closing his eyes not to sleep, but to disappear for a moment. Michael Jackson choosing routes with fewer lights, fewer people, fewer chances to be seen. These were not habits of superstition. They were acts of self-preservation. The world had taught Michael Jackson that being visible came at a cost, and so, in that car, he practiced the opposite. The chauffeur once reflected that Michael Jackson never spoke badly about anyone during those drives. Not his accusers. Not the media. Not even fate itself. The silence was not filled with bitterness. It was filled with restraint. As if he understood that anger would only tighten the cage he was already trapped in. That restraint was the most shocking part, because history paints Michael Jackson as extreme fame, extreme talent, extreme controversy. But the man in the car was measured. Controlled. Gentle in ways that contradicted the chaos surrounding his name. And perhaps that is why the chauffeur felt such a responsibility to remember him correctly. Not loudly. But truthfully. As time passed, fans began to romanticize Michael Jackson's loneliness. They called it tragic, poetic, inevitable. The chauffeur rejected those words. Loneliness, he believed, was not destiny. It was consequence. The result of a world that demanded access without offering understanding. Michael Jackson did not seek silence because he was broken. That he sought it because it was the only place where he could remain whole. One evening, years after everything, the chauffeur attended a small gathering where Michael Jackson's music played softly in the background. People talked over it. Laughed. Debated theories. Argued legacies. The chauffeur stood near the edge of the room, listening. When one song ended and another began, there was a brief moment of quiet between tracks. That pause stopped him cold. For a split second, it felt like being back in the car. The engine humming. The city moving. Michael Jackson breathing quietly behind him. It reminded him that the most honest parts of life often exist in transitions, in what comes before applause and after it fades. That was when the chauffeur realized something deeply unsettling and deeply beautiful. Michael Jackson had prepared him for this. By teaching him how to sit with silence, Michael Jackson had unknowingly given him a way to grieve without spectacle. To remember without distortion. To honor without noise. The sentence Michael Jackson spoke was not just about that night. It was a philosophy disguised as a plea. I just wanted to be quiet again. Not because he wanted to disappear, but because he wanted to be human, and maybe that is the final truth hidden inside this story. Michael Jackson's greatest vulnerability was not his fame. It was his hope, that somewhere, somehow, he could exist without being interpreted, analyzed, or consumed. The chauffeur carries that hope forward now. In the way he listens more than he speaks. In the way he refuses to reduce people to headlines. In the way he understands that silence can be an offering, not an absence, because some stories are not meant to end with answers, they are meant to end with understanding. And still, the quiet keeps unfolding, because silence, once shared, never truly releases you. The chauffeur eventually understood that his memories of Michael Jackson were not frozen moments from the past, they were living things, reshaping how he moved through the world. He noticed it when people raised their voices unnecessarily. When conversations became performances. When empathy was replaced by certainty. In those moments, he would remember the man in the back seat who chose restraint over reaction, calm over confrontation. Michael Jackson had mastered something the world rarely teaches, the ability to withdraw without becoming cold. There was one last habit the chauffeur remembered with painful clarity. Before stepping out of the car, Michael Jackson would pause, just for a second, hand resting on the door handle. It was as if he were deciding which version of himself to bring outside. The private man, or the public symbol. That pause was invisible to everyone else, but not to the one person watching from the front seat. The chauffeur now believes that pause was Michael Jackson's truest moment, not the applause. Not the controversies. But that breath between safety and exposure. Years later, when people ask why this story matters, why another story about Michael Jackson should be told at all, the answer is simple. Because this story is not about fame. It is about what fame costs. About what happens when a human being becomes an idea before the world finishes understanding the person. Michael Jackson gave everything loudly. His silence was the only thing he kept for himself, and that silence was never empty. It was filled with dignity. With exhaustion. With hope that someone, somewhere, would understand without demanding proof. The chauffeur understands now that he was not just driving a man. He was witnessing a negotiation between humanity and mythology. Every quiet mile was a refusal to let the legend completely erase the person. That is why the sentence still matters, not because it was dramatic. Not because it was tragic. But because it was universal. Who among us has not wished, at least once, for the world to quiet down? To stop judging. To stop demanding. To stop watching. Michael Jackson simply had the courage to say it out loud, once, when he knew he was safe, and maybe that is the reason this story endures. Because in the silence of that car, Michael Jackson was not the king of pop. He was not a headline. He was not a symbol. He was just a man asking for peace. And perhaps the most haunting part of this story is not what Michael Jackson said, but what he never had the chance to say again. The chauffeur often wondered what would have happened if the world had given Michael Jackson more rooms like that car. Spaces without microphones. Without expectations. Without judgment disguised as curiosity. Would the sentence have changed? Would it have softened into relief instead of longing? We will never know, but what remains is the echo of restraint. Michael Jackson never used the chauffeur as a shield, never turned him into a therapist, never unloaded the weight of his life onto another human being. He understood something rare, that not every burden should be transferred. Some must simply be endured quietly, with dignity. That dignity stayed with the chauffeur. That he noticed it when people spoke about Michael Jackson in absolutes, as if a life could be flattened into a verdict. He noticed it when empathy became conditional, offered only if it aligned with opinion. In those moments, he would think back to the man who thanked him every night, who asked for the long way home, who trusted silence more than defense. Michael Jackson had been listened to by millions, but he had been understood by very few, and understanding, the chauffeur learned, is never loud. It does not interrupt. It does not demand explanation. It sits patiently in the passenger seat and lets the road unfold. There is a reason this story feels unfinished, because Michael Jackson's life itself was unfinished, not in ambition, not in talent, but in peace. He never reached the point where the noise stopped chasing him. The sentence he spoke was not closure. It was a wish suspended in motion, like a car driving endlessly through the night, yet, in a quiet way, that wish survived. That it survived in the man who learned how to listen without consuming. That it survived in the habit of choosing silence over spectacle. That it survived in the refusal to turn a human being into a headline. And now, it survives here, not as proof, not as argument, but as remembrance. Because remembering Michael Jackson does not require us to agree on everything. It only requires us to acknowledge one truth: behind the fame, behind the mythology, behind the noise, there was a human being who wanted the same thing we all want when the world becomes too heavy. A moment of quiet, and in that quiet, something unexpected begins to happen. The chauffeur came to realize that silence does not erase pain, it reorganizes it. It gives pain shape, boundaries, a place to rest. Michael Jackson understood this instinctively. That car was not an escape vehicle. It was a container. A moving room where the chaos of the outside world could not intrude unless invited. There were nights when the chauffeur sensed Michael Jackson was listening more than thinking. Listening to the engine, to the rhythm of the road, to the faint life of the city passing by. Listening, perhaps, for proof that the world could exist without demanding anything from him. Those nights felt lighter, as if the weight shifted just enough to let him breathe. The chauffeur also noticed that Michael Jackson never asked to be reassured. Never asked what people were saying. Never asked how things would turn out. That kind of silence was not fear, it was discipline. He had learned that once words leave your mouth, they belong to everyone else. Silence, on the other hand, remains yours. This was the paradox of Michael Jackson, the most visible man on the planet guarding the smallest private space with unwavering resolve. After his passing, the chauffeur began to understand why that mattered. The world rushed to fill the silence Michael Jackson left behind, with opinions, with reconstructions, with noise disguised as remembrance. But the chauffeur knew that true remembrance required restraint. To speak less. To listen more. To let the unanswered remain unanswered. There are people who believe every story must end with clarity. Michael Jackson's does not. And that, perhaps, is the point, because clarity is a luxury rarely afforded to those who live under constant observation. Michael Jackson lived his entire life being interpreted in real time. The silence of that car was the only place where interpretation stopped. Where he did not need to perform innocence or genius or strength. Where he could simply exist. That existence, quiet, contained, human, is what this story protects. The chauffeur never claims to know the full truth about Michael Jackson. He claims something far more honest. He knew the part of Michael Jackson that did not ask to be believed. Only respected, and respect, like silence, does not announce itself. That it lingers. That it changes how you drive. How you listen. How you speak about people who cannot speak for themselves anymore. So if this story feels long, unfinished, or lingering, that is intentional. Because silence does not conclude, it echoes. And the echo of Michael Jackson's quiet wish still moves through the night, through memory, through anyone willing to pause and listen. If you've stayed with this story until now, subscribe, like, and share this video. Help this channel continue honoring legends not by amplifying noise, but by preserving the human silence they trusted most.